sort of dampers the technology development and research that can take place and slows the process down. It's even gone so far as the European, like the ITAR has become so bad that the Europeans have developed an entire market around ITAR-free satellites. They're saying that, okay, you can, here, we'll sell you this satellite which has American components on it, which is ITAR controlled. It'll take you 6 years to build it. But we can also build you an ITAR-free one, which costs perhaps a little bit more, but we can get it to you in 3 years. And major communication companies look at that and say, well, 3 years, that's billions of dollars that we can get sooner. So they're going with the ITAR-free satellites nowadays. And covered this. Interesting anecdote, just to kind of touch on what's being said here. What's a TAA, which is essentially it's an agreement that any company signs with an American company that says, we promise not to divulge any of the information that you give us in the development of our product, as you know, and any technical data that you give us. And an interesting anecdote that I have from experience is I was working on a project for the Canadian Space Agency with a contracted company, and we purchased some items from the US, and we had to sign one of these TAAs. And at the end of the contract to the CSA, we could not give them certain portions of our report, even though the CSA had funded the project. So basically Canadian tax dollars, it was, I don't even remember what the number was, but Canadian tax dollars were being bought for a report which was all censored. Because the Canadian Space Agency's policy and the Canadian government's policy is not to sign these kinds of agreements, because the Canadian government, when they buy stuff, becomes Crown property, and that makes it completely publicly available. But that is completely contradictory to what is imposed by things like ITAR, which restricts who sees that information. So you have Canadian investment going into research and development that they ultimately can't look at. So I just find it rather funny. It's like, you know, buying a book at Chapters, and you know, the middle 3 chapters are ripped out because we're Canadian. And part of that. This was something interesting that Mike Griffin, asset administrator, had quoted, that the United States working alone cannot fulfill the sweeping goals of the vision for space exploration. But the things like the Cassini mission to Saturn would not have been possible given the ITAR environment that exists today, because there was huge cooperation and huge exchange of information when developing the Cassini mission, that information would not at all be possible. Like, you couldn't exchange that information at all today. And that's basically my whirlwind tour. And we'll open it up to questions. I don't know. He's criticizing my slides. Sorry.
Just curious, but I'm sorry we don't say that. Yeah. I'm just curious about the information that you can get from Europe, sort of non-proprietary stuff. Is there enough technology out there now that you can basically build launch vehicles and satellites and whatnot?
Absolutely. And that's been one of the perverse impacts of the American ITAR regime, is that what it's done is that it's encouraged other countries outside of the United States to develop their own indigenous capabilities for these types of endeavors. And in fact, there is now concern in the United States within the industry, within space agencies, that really it's backfired, and in fact this has jeopardized American national security, because whereas before, if they were using American technology, it was still something that they could monitor, that they could control, keep an eye on, And now, because of the ITAR regime, there are other countries, potentially adversarial countries in some respects, that are developing their own technologies and then reselling to others to which they have no control over whatsoever.
And this kind of goes back to what I alluded to early on, talking about these companies in Canada that are developing propulsion systems and having our own launch capability. Canada's just the next candidate for developing that, because a lot of these companies that are developing the propulsion systems can't sell their systems to the US. So now they're struggling, okay, where's our market? So part of that market is filled up by selling overseas, and to places like Europe and specifically France and places like that. But then also looking inwards into Canada to Canadians that want to launch spacecraft but can't because of ITAR restrictions, and it becomes expensive to launch in other countries, so why not just launch them locally?
Yeah, perhaps just to go back on a little bit of this ITAR thing, because it is sort of a hot issue in the space business. Has been for the last number of years. And I guess one of the first things to realize is ITAR, International Traffic and Arms Regulations, is a system of export control to prevent sensitive technologies from potentially falling into the wrong hands. And of course, you can define, you can judge for yourself who constitutes the wrong hands. But it does serve a very legitimate national security purpose. What has perhaps gone wrong or gone astray in the ITAR regime is that until the mid-1990s in the United States, most civilian and scientific space technologies, for example, for commercial satellites and for scientific endeavors, was not governed by what's called the U.S. munitions list, the USML. And the U.S. munitions list is exactly that. It's a list of technologies that are considered by the State Department to be dual-use, potentially militarily sensitive. So until the mid to late 1990s, most space technologies were in fact not on that list, and they were free and clear. They were actually controlled under a separate regime by the Commerce Department. What happened in the 90s was, you may recall, there were some rocket accidents involving Chinese rockets, and it was alleged these rockets were actually carrying American satellites. And it was alleged that during the investigation of these rocket mishaps in China, that sensitive U.S. technologies were transferred to the Chinese. And basically, congressional Republicans seized on this to try to embarrass the Clinton administration, that the Clinton administration was allegedly weak on national security. And subsequent to that, in 1999, was when the transfer of what were formerly civilian, commercial, and scientific space technologies fell under the jurisdiction of the U.S. munitions list, and hence under the control of ITAR.
Well, I'm all for scientific knowledge, but I have a bit of a philosophical problem dealing with the consequences of science. The evolution of scientific technology has come a long way since the Stone Age. But when you look at it, our brain is still functioning as a Stone Age brain. And when we look at all the benefits, there's also, we have global warming and war machines of a technical and tribal nature. I'm just wondering where all this is leading us to, and how we can control, in other words, promote science and exploration, but at the same time prevent warfare and things of this nature, and global warming. So I have trepidations about going, in one direction without looking at where civilization is going. Do you have any comments?
Oh, thanks.
You stick your neck out and I'll be
Mind using the mic?
Oh, sure.
We're filming this.
So you missed all of my ITAR ranting there. Okay. There's a very interesting quote from John F. Kennedy. He was once asked, what is the difference between the Atlas rocket that put John Glenn in orbit